Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining Humanities Kansas for the big idea. I know a few people are still coming in off of the waiting room, but I want to go ahead and get started because we have such a great topic today, and I don't want us to lose a minute of time. So my name is Julie Mulvihill. I'm the Executive Director of Humanities Kansas, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event. First, a couple of housekeeping tasks. We are going to ask you to stay on mute throughout the presentation, but we very much want your questions. So if you will use the chat box function throughout the entire presentation, put your questions and your comments in there, and we will circle back to them throughout the next hour and definitely try to get to as many, if not all of them, that we can. So thank you for doing that. Today's big idea is it's time to understand the history of Black voting rights with Dr. Kim Warren. And before we turn it over to Dr. Warren and Dr. Mendoza, I did want to mention a couple of special things about today's presentation. This conversation is part of The Art of Voting, which is a pop-up exhibition that is located in 6 communities across Kansas right now. So you could visit this pop-up exhibit indoor and outdoors in Wyandotte County at the museum, at the Abilene Public Library, Sharon Springs Public Library, Coronado Quivira Museum in Lyons, Dodge City Community College, McPherson Museum, and I think that's it. Sharon Springs, McPherson, Abilene, Lyons, Wyandotte County, Dodge City. So be sure and see that. This exhibit was designed to help us explore this idea of the impact of the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. And it was inspired by an original exhibit done by the Watkins Museum of History in Lawrence. And they created this concept and then used local artists who submitted drawings and illustrations inspired by the act of voting. And that's where the Art of Voting title for the exhibit comes from. The Art of Voting project is actually funded in part by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation as part of the Why It Matters initiative. So we are just absolutely delighted to have this be part of it, including this presentation today. For those of you who have been with us before for these Big Idea monthly online programs, you'll know that each Big Idea starts with a short essay, and we circulate that on our website and through our social media. You're invited to read about the topic before you join us on the Zoom. If you didn't have a chance to read the essay, we're going to put a link to it in the chat box, and you can circle back to it at the end of this, and we hope that you do. And we hope that the Big Idea conversation and the essay together sparks a conversation for you to have with your friends and your family as you go about your daily life with having FaceTime meetings and Zoom meetings with your loved ones, or if you're lucky enough to have a few inside with you as well. So with that, I want to introduce to you Dr. Valerie Mendoza. Valerie is the director of the Title III Strengthened Institutions Grant at Washburn University. She is a native Kansan and earned her PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. So thank you, Dr. Mendoza, and welcome to the Big Idea.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to have all of you here. Thank you for making time for this. We're really excited about today's Big Idea. So I'm going to introduce Professor Kim Warren at the University of Kansas, where she is the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the School of Social Welfare and Associate Professor of History. Professor Warren's research interests include the history of gender and race in African American and Native American education. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here in this Zoom space.
Yes. And before everybody came on, both Kim and I were talking about our dogs, so you might get to meet them. They're unpredictable. So Kim, in your Big Idea, you talk about the importance and the limitations of the 15th Amendment, but also as it relates to the 13th and 14th Amendments, which came before it. So can you briefly refresh our memories as to what each of these amendments say?
Sure. And I'm so grateful that we're celebrating an anniversary of an amendment, of the 15th Amendment, but that we're having this conversation about the 15th in the larger context, thinking about the 15th Amendment as the third in a series of amendments that are often referred to as the Civil War amendments. And collectively, sometimes citizens and historians think back and look at those amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, as amendments that were supposed to provide or ensure some sort of equality for African Americans. And to a certain extent, they did. I interpret the passage of those amendments as a political strategy to bring Southern states back into the Union. And I can talk about that as we go along. But just briefly to remind people, the 13th Amendment is basically the amendment that abolishes slavery for good. It finishes the job that Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation started in some of the border states. The 13th Amendment says constitutionally slavery can no longer exist in any of the states in the country. So that's kind of the short descriptor for the 13th. The 14th Amendment is actually thought of as a very straightforward amendment. I think it's one of the most complicated amendments, but this is the one that you all might think about when you're thinking about natural born citizenship. This idea that if one is born on US soil, one is automatically a US citizen. That's the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also provides for due process. It also helps us to think about what a citizen is in the United States. How this relates to voting is this is the first time in the Constitution that the word male is inserted into the Constitution through an amendment. So citizenship is defined, and it's particularly defined as male in the 14th Amendment. This becomes really a controversial issue and also an important issue because when the 15th Amendment is ratified 2 years later, the 15th Amendment is the one that says that government should not deny US citizens, okay, the ones who were defined as citizens by the 14th Amendment, shall not deny US citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or past servitude. So people often think of the 15th Amendment as the amendment that gave Black men the right to vote, which is generally accurate. What it really does is it provides for suffrage, for voting for citizens. And those citizens get defined in the previous amendment. The other thing that I wanted to briefly mention about the 14th is that there are a lot of clauses that also exclude certain people from citizenship. So obviously women, but also certain Native Americans whose nations or tribes were not in certain treaty agreements with the federal government. So my point, though, is that I think we have to think about the 13th, 14th, and 15th in relationship with each other when we're thinking about the ways in which enslaved people, men and women, were officially freed, and how African-American men ostensibly had the right to vote with the 14th and 15th Amendments, and how African-American women were universally excluded from those rights with those passages, even though they were involved in both abolition movements and women's rights movements.
Yeah, so those amendments kind of stack on top of each other and build on top of each other. We'll get back to voting for a second, but I am so fascinated by what you said about the definition of citizenship and the fact that Native Americans couldn't vote or couldn't be citizens in many cases. That's
Yeah.
such a I don't know, oxymoron.
Well, and let me clarify. The clause says certain Native American tribes. It probably actually says Indian tribes in the actual language, and it's certain ones, and it depended again on the tribe's treaty status with the federal government. So Native American citizenship broadly doesn't really get addressed. This issue of if you're born on US soil or not, are you a US citizen or not, that really doesn't get addressed until a 1924 Citizenship Act for Native Americans specifically. So they're not, although some Native Americans would have been included with the 14th Amendment, some would not have been.
Yeah, crazy. So as you were talking, the passage of the 15th Amendment, it causes controversy on so many levels. Sure. Among so many groups of people. And I think that, you alluded to that with that word male slipped into the Constitution. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, and I think what's really important to remember is that, leading into the Civil War, if we think about it as a war that takes place much longer than most people expected, 1861 to 1865, but in the decades leading up to the Civil War, there's a really active abolition movement, a movement to try to free slaves. It's not necessarily a movement that is necessarily campaigning for equal rights among all the races, but certainly is arguing for the abolition of slavery in all of the states. And there's also a fairly active women's rights movement going on, and voting is one of the key issues for the women's rights movement, but there are many other issues on the platform, including right to wages, right to custody of children, right to inherit, all of those types of things, along with voting. The reason that I'm mentioning that is that a lot of abolitionists are also women's rights advocates, but certainly more women's rights advocates are also abolitionists, or even coming out of the abolition movement, learning how to campaign, how to make arguments, and so forth. So I see this, 1840s, 50s, 60s, there's a kind of overlap. It's not a perfect marriage, but there's an overlap between folks who are really campaigning to get rid of slavery and really campaigning for women's rights. And a lot of those folks were the same people. So when Congress is making a decision about the 13th Amendment, was certainly supported by all parties who would have been involved in these two movements. But when Congress is making decisions about the language of the 14th Amendment, and there is news that this word male is going to be inserted, this is really upsetting to people who are fighting for women's rights, because they are recognizing, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, are recognizing right away that this is going to be a big problem for women's suffrage, for the passage of women's suffrage. Stanton even said, if that word male is inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out. Meaning that, it might take 100 years to get it reversed. So it took another 50, but I don't think she was out of bounds in her estimation.
Right.
So what it ends up doing is, because it ends up forcing folks who would have otherwise campaigned for both, it forces them to prioritize. And so there's a real rift between folks who want to see Black men get the vote before white women, and white women who want to get the vote before Black men. That's the big rift. And of course, Black women are in the midst of this, feeling doubly excluded from this conversation.
I was just going to ask, what did Black women think about this? Exclusion.
Well, I mean, Black women. So if you think, for example, about somebody like Sojourner Truth, who's she's most probably famously known for her "Aren't I a Woman" speech, which may or may not have been accurately recorded, but certainly the sentiment is probably historically accurate. And what she was saying was, I'm both Black and a woman. Like, I embody both of these identities and need these rights because of both of these parts of me. I can't separate these things. But you can see how in the larger group of advocates, of people campaigning, of reformers, large groups of white women were sort of pulled toward their own priority, and large groups of Black men or people advocating for Black men were pulled in that direction. It even got to the point where people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were otherwise very much in support of African-American rights, that many times she sounded racist when criticizing the possibility that Black men would get the vote first. And it even made people like Frederick Douglass, who all along had been advocating for women's rights, it made him sound sexist sometimes when he was saying, wait, why shouldn't Black men get the right to vote first? So it's the amendment that it's the 14th Amendment that forces this controversy, and then the 15th Amendment that follows, that says, all citizens can vote. You all should be happy. But women's rights advocates are saying, we know that we have just been constitutionally excluded because of the 14th.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think you make such a good point about reminding us that for everyone, abolition did not necessarily mean equality, right? And I love, Sojourner Truth's speech is so powerful because she's refuting all of those, reasons for why women should be excluded. Oh, they're delicate, they can't think. And she's like, wait a minute, look at me.
Right. Do I need help into a carriage? I would like it, but I don't need it. And I'm still a woman, and I still deserve these rights. And I think, another figure that I look at, because you asked about Black women in particular, Ida B. Wells is an African-American woman who is certainly, is part of the abolition movement, but she really becomes more well-known as a journalist who writes out protesting, first actually documenting the number of racially motivated lynchings in the United States. She becomes well known for that, but is certainly entrenched in the women's rights movement as well throughout her professional life, even though she experiences a certain amount of racism even within the women's rights movement. So I point these things out, not at all to disparage anyone who was working on behalf of expanding enfranchisement for any group of Americans. I point this out so that when we're looking back at history, we're not making such broad generalizations. We're really trying to understand that people advocating for their rights weren't advocating for everyone's rights. And sometimes they were forced into situations where they felt that they had to prioritize their rights, their identity group rights, over somebody else's.
Yeah. So how were the freed men, emphasis on the men part there, able to take advantage of these new voting rights? How did all that play out?
Well, for a while, there were some African-American men who were able to exercise this new right to vote after 1870. But one of the things that, and actually I should also mention that there were a number of African-American men who were elected to office, a few at the federal level, more at the state level. And that happened for a short period of time after the Civil War. W.E.B. Du Bois, I think, probably said it best when he said, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back towards slavery. And what he reminds us of in that quotation is that although slavery wasn't reinstituted in the United States, after this kind of moment, after 1870 of protected rights or rights that are ensured by the Constitution, what happened was a wave of local, state, and municipal and county laws, and also just ways of behaving, norms that prevented African Americans from using those rights. So although initially there were many African American men who were able to vote, some who were able to actually get elected into office, certainly by the late 1870s and 1880s, there are a number of laws on the books that are preventing them from exercising this constitutional right that they have. And those are commonly known as Jim Crow laws. These laws that are, and I want to say that sometimes they're laws, and again, sometimes they're just rules or ways of behaving, but but what they do is they don't reverse the right. Okay, African-American men still have the right to vote, but what these other rules and laws do is they prevent eligible voters or people who have the right to vote from exercising their vote. And that's the key thing that I think we really need to understand when we're thinking about the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment doesn't just, it provides a right, but it doesn't provide any kind of mechanism to ensure that Black men, these new voters, can actually use their vote.
And that's kind of a rude awakening too, when you think about it, right? Because there's like our Constitution, that's like inviolable, but it says that we can vote, but yet we can't, right? That's one of the things I was thinking as you were talking, like that makes, the election of the senator from Georgia, this last election, so amazing,
This is the constant issue that I would encourage people to keep thinking about and keep working on, because there are lots of ways in which citizens, Americans, Kansans have rights, but there's always a question about whether or not folks can exercise those rights. Now, I would say in the 21st century, we're probably all able to exercise many more rights than ever before. But if you think about, let's think about like what prevented Black men from using their vote in the late 1800s, and then we can compare that to today. So back then, these Jim Crow laws or these ways of preventing men included like asking these new voters to take a literacy test, or asking them to pay. That's where that term poll tax comes from. Or saying, yes, in our county, yes, you have the right to vote as afforded to you by the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution. But in our county, you can only actually exercise that vote if your grandfather could exercise that vote. That's where the phrase grandfather clause comes from. And of course, many African-American men, especially those who had just been freed, their grandfathers weren't enfranchised, and many of them couldn't even identify who their grandfathers were.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got a great example here, primary source.
Yeah, this is a voting, a literacy test from Sumter County, Georgia, from the 1960s. And the answers are filled in. This is as part of civil rights trying to register Black voters in Georgia. So civil rights groups actually gave this out in advance with the answers, and you can see them here. But Kim and I were talking before about how difficult some of the questions are in this literacy test.
Yeah, if I were given a test at the poll today that asked me questions like this, like how many federal judges are there in your state? I think one of the questions was, what's the definition of a capital crime? Write verbatim all of the language that's included in a certain amendment to the US Constitution or the state constitution. I certainly wouldn't be able to answer all of those questions accurately. So you can imagine what new voters were thinking when they approached the polls and they were told, yeah, you could vote, but only if you pass this test, only if you have this knowledge that really no one but a law book would actually have possession of at that time. There was also, and I'm glad that you can keep this up so that our participants can take a look at these types of questions. I also want to say that there was a lot of intimidation, a lot of violence, a lot of threat to property and to person. There was a lot of intimidation that built up during the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, even into the 20th century, preventing Black voters from being able to exercise their right to vote. So you could see how it took quite a lot of effort and bravery, and even maybe risk of life to exercise this right that was supposed to be guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and even as something as, not maybe physically intimidating as this literacy test, but still it's intimidating in a different way, right? Just, making sure you have that knowledge. And even if you're given the answers and memorize them, but what if I get it wrong or I forget, or, test anxiety, right?
Right. No, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear is building during this time period. The 1880s to 1920s is often considered, the decades that are most racially violent in U.S. history, because of this uncertainty about whether or not people could vote and own land and so forth, because of these questions about what it really meant for Black people to be free in the United States and so forth. This is also a time period, especially
the Western University before it was, I don't think so, but
it was freedom school.
Well, I know it was, but I don't know if we have an image.
Okay, there we go. I just wanted to mention the other thing that's happening. So I mentioned Jim Crow laws. I mentioned, norms and rules that get established that aren't necessarily on the law books, but are just happening during this time period. This is also a rise in white supremacy and the KKK, especially in the 20th century. There's a woman that I study named Mary McLeod Bethune, who founded a school in Florida, and she had many stories about having to stand on her school grounds at night, telling her students to stay in their rooms, and just standing in silence while members of the KKK would ride on horses and in robes, with the express purpose of intimidating her and her staff from registering to vote or registering other people to vote or to show up at the polls on election day. So that's just another example of what was going on.
Yeah, but yet, despite all of these fear and intimidation tactics and Jim Crow, you write in your big idea essay that the 15th Amendment was also important because of the precedents that it set. What were some of those?
Right. Well, the 15th Amendment is essentially saying that citizens have the right to vote. So it's the and it's saying that the government can't prohibit based on race and color and previous servitude. So the idea from 1870 to, when we finally get to a Voting Rights Act in 1965 is that it's not just the responsibility of individual voters to exercise this right, but it really is the job of the U.S. government or local governments to make clear who has these rights and who has the right to exercise them. So we see over time that these categories, once these categories, race, color, or previous condition of servitude are placed into this amendment, we see over time how other categories get added as categories that can't be discriminated against over time. So, gender identity, sex, sexuality, religious identity, and so forth. But if I could skip ahead to this, if that's okay, is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to ask you about the 1965
Right.
Voting Rights Amendment because you just mentioned it. So yeah, please.
Yeah. So it's important. So again, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think it's just so important for people to think about rights, and then how people exercise these rights, because that's really the 15th Amendment really helps us think about that. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, it's signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. It's not another amendment to the Constitution. What it does is it's the enforcement of any previous amendment that has anything to do with voting. So by 1965, you not only have the 15th Amendment that allows for a kind of male suffrage, but you also have the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920 that allows for universal woman's right to vote. So the 1965 Act, it's not another amendment to the Constitution. What it does is at the federal level, it says that smaller governments, so states, counties, cities, can't use these other methods of exclusion. Okay. It doesn't really say anything about expanding the right to vote at all. The right to vote is there. What the act does is it says from the top, from the federal government is saying lower governments, smaller governments can't pass these other laws as a way of excluding people from using the rights they have, particularly within the context of voting.
Yeah, and there was so much agitation leading up to that right, the Voting Rights Act, right?
Absolutely.
Johnson really was hard pressed to sign. I mean, it was something that was hard fought for, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I want you to speak to that in a second, but I also wanted to let our audience know that we're going to be posting in the chat two things related to this. One is a timeline of voting rights. So you can see like when people were, like the Native Americans, women, when they were allowed to officially vote. And the second thing we're going to be posting is, and this goes back to my kind of lead up to the 65 Voting Rights Act, is that Langston Hughes wrote a play about voting. It's one of his lesser known works until recently. And the link we're posting is a link to a site from Yale, the Beneke Library, which houses Hughes's papers. And it's Yale students reading the play from this past October as a lead up to the November elections. So after you all, after our discussion, if y'all want more about voting, you can listen to that play because it's really the ballot and me is what it's called. But yes, so the lead up to this fight over the passage of the 65 Voting Rights Act.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, Valerie, of course, voting rights was not at the top of President Johnson's agenda, and he really inherited this from President Kennedy. Although this was a struggle to have President John Kennedy embrace this idea as well. Robert Kennedy was certainly an advocate. So I think when we think about the 1965 Act, we think about it in relation to, the March on Washington in 1963 and kind of the 60s as being a quintessential sort of height of civil rights activity. We think about, this time period, especially with the March on Washington as Martin Luther King's rise to prominence as a national leader. And I think all of that is very important. And it's important to remember that the March on Washington was a march for jobs and for rights. And so many civil rights groups were in negotiation with parts of the federal government to try to address these issues at a federal level. So I do think it's important to think about the Voting Rights Act as something that emerged out of the context of the 1960s. But I think, as a historian, I also want to encourage people to look back. It didn't suddenly emerge. And I also want to give credit to if we think about, the 15th Amendment in 1870 and Voting Rights Act in 1965, it's almost, it's 95 years of work that includes people that I was talking about before, Ida B. Wells on an anti-lynching campaign and getting groups to advocate for a federal anti-lynching law. We have to remember that the Niagara movement starts in the early 1900s, and many people who started that kind of civil rights gathering group merged or helped to form the NAACP. And then the NAACP during the 1900s leading up to the Voting Rights Act, their work is totally focused on overturning these laws at a local level, but also working for these kind of federal provisions that will prohibit discriminatory laws at a lower level. So we've got to remember that work too. Think about Black educators who are starting and maintaining schools for Black children, often segregated, often separate from white communities, but certainly embraced by Black educators because they understand that education is a means for racial uplift. Black women are organizing in clubs, especially during the 1920s, 1930s. Well, even before that, they're organizing. So they're not politically enfranchised, but they see coming together as groups of women and thinking about how to improve their committees or their communities as political action. So I think that I want us to, the 65 Act is so significant. It's so important. It's so important that there are these moments when the federal government makes these declarations that are supposed to ensure equality and access to rights. But I think it's also important to think about, all of the work on the ground that was done to prepare for this. I mean, even if you think about between 1870 and 1965, how many, 2 world wars took place where African-American men were enlisting and fighting in these wars and proving their patriotism. And, these types of actions were really important for setting the political stage for the 65 Act to be passed.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that all that ground work level, grassroots level work that was going on, because we tend to think of, the NAACP, at the national level, forgetting, the NAACP at the local level, or, or the women's groups as well, that were all so important to that. And that leads me kind of jumping ahead to current day and more grassroots work, because many have argued that the Black vote, especially in Georgia, and especially with Stacey Abrams, was what put Biden over the top in the most recent presidential election. And we could even trace that backwards, right? The Black vote put into office Obama, Clinton, and countless other local and state officials. So you can speak to how important the Black vote is, not only nationally, but, at state and local levels as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely important, especially if we think about, how many decades African Americans, men and women, were not able to exercise the right that they had. And even with the 1965 Act that, places federal pressure on states and counties and so forth, there were still a lot of ways in which Black voters, Latino voters, voters who you might consider in a lower socioeconomic class, how they weren't necessarily like approaching the polls and being given a literacy test like in the 1870s or 1880s, but there were other barriers put in place to prevent them from having easy access to exercising their right to vote. So the percentage of eligible voters, particularly Black voters, really only increases. It steadily increases over the decades after 1965, but it really peaks in terms of like 65% of eligible voters voting in like 1992 with Clinton, I believe. Or I think actually even 70% of eligible voters were voting then. And now it's around 65%, which doesn't seem like a lot. Like in grade school, that would not be a passing grade. But for American voters, that's actually quite significant, since American voters in general don't have a great track record of using of eligible voters going to the polls. The point that I'm making is that because there's been this long history of voter suppression among Black voters for whatever reason, out and out district redistricting, having the polls open only on a work day, moving the polls to different locations, having to get a mail-in ballot notarized, and knowing that some folks have to pay for that notary. These are all sort of modern day examples of barriers that I think are significant. So that's why it's so important to see, like, when voters who have received a message or even some sort of pressure not to vote actually turn out. Like, that's why it's so significant. And certainly the numbers are showing that.
Yeah, it was so inspiring seeing people, standing in line and, all that sort of thing. That segues really nicely into our first question that we have from Kyle. And I'll encourage any of you all out there listening, if you are watching, if you have a question, to go ahead and type it to the chat. But Kyle was saying exactly what you were saying. Race discrimination in voting still happens. It seems there's still widespread voter disenfranchisement today, such as the things you mentioned: voter ID laws, restriction of mail-in voting, and that disenfranchisement falls along race lines. But we are seeing an uptick in these laws creating race-based barriers, especially since the last election. Right. So Kyle says that Section 2 of the 15th Amendment, the enforcement provision, seems ripe for use. So the question is, do you think now that there has been a change in administration, do we have a Democratic majority in both houses, we might see some federal legislation using Section 2 of the 15th Amendment that might address this trend?
It's a great question, and really good examples, Kyle, of existing of modern day barriers that certainly do exist. I don't know if there's been an increase in the number of barriers. I think that there's been an increase in the awareness of barriers, certainly. And I do hope, yes, I do think that this is a ripe time to address at the federal level, also to have cases go through the Supreme Court to address voter representation and access and any voter suppression activities that have taken place over the past 2 decades. Yes, I hope that will happen. I think that, in 2020, 2021, we're seeing a series of global crises hitting us at the same time that is causing a tremendous amount of pressure on President Biden to set an agenda. But if we didn't have a medical pandemic, we might remember that voting issues were at the top of big political protest before the pandemic. So I hope that continues to be an important priority.
Yeah. Another question from Leanne: are there ways that we as individual citizens can combat voter disenfranchisement? I know there were ways to report instances of voting discrimination, at election time, but I'm not sure that I've heard as much about what happens after those have been reported. Like what?
Yeah, another great question. First of all, we need to know what rights we have, and we need to exercise the rights that we do have. I always tell my students, I will never tell you how to vote unless you want to come and talk to me outside of the classroom. I will never impose upon you my views of how to vote, but I will tell you that it is your obligation to vote, because there's so many people who literally died so that we can exercise our right to vote. and knowing that history is really important. First of all, certainly standing up and saying something if you're seeing something at the polls. But also, I would encourage, I as an academic, I think that it is, when I look at like the history of voting in our country and in other countries, as it has existed and exists today, I think that the fact that in the United States we vote on one day, typically, whether it's a city election or a federal election, that it is on a weekday, that the hours are typically during work time. I mean, even if the polls open at 6 a.m., it's still difficult for some people to leave work. There's in most cases, I know that this is different for certain employees, but in most cases, people cannot leave their jobs without risking, not getting paid for that hour or so. So I think as individuals, as individual voting Americans, we need to think about pressuring our elected officials to changing the way that we vote in the United States and widening access as much as possible.
Yeah. Kyle put some information, a link in the chat for the bills restricting voting. So if you all are interested in that. And yeah, Leanne comments, I've often wondered why Election Day isn't a national holiday, especially, this last election with the pandemic and how voting was actually dangerous, because of the virus, right? In person, at least.
Yeah, I mean, in other countries, so I recall when I was in graduate school, my friend who was a French citizen actually flew home to cast his vote, and there were 3 days to do it, and they were national holidays. And I believe in this last election, or not in our election, but in Australia, in their last election, there was some requirement, right, that if folks who had the right to vote didn't vote, they were somehow taxed or fined. So I'm not suggesting a kind of punitive model, but I am absolutely making an argument for making it as easy as possible for people to use the rights that they have.
Yeah. And, talking about the Black vote in particular, one of the things I'm reminded of is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and, how Black men especially, but Black women also are incarcerated at exceptionally high rates, and how incarcerated people, once they're free, are oftentimes disenfranchised. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that, I mean, it's another example of the ways in which certain parts of the population are have consequences that don't exist for other parts of the population. And certainly there are a lot of people who argue that once somebody is out of jail or out of prison, their rights should be restored. And then there are many others who argue that there's too much of what they call a pipeline into prison for too many Black males in particular in the first place, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Yeah,
absolutely. Angela Davis works on this as well. It's a huge problem in the United States.
Yeah. Other questions anybody has? This has been such a wonderful, rich discussion.
Valerie, I hate to intrude, but Virgil Dean has a question for you in the chat box. I'm happy to read. Did you find that?
Yes,
Great.
I see it.
Great.
Virgil's question is, can you elaborate on your interpretation that the Civil War amendments were designed to bring the South back into the Union?
Thank you, my friend Virgil Dean. Nice to hear from you in the chat. Yes, I just wanted to make that distinction because as an academic, I do agree that we should think about these amendments in relationship with each other and not just separately or individually. And I think it's fine to interpret them as, the Civil War amendments. But I also think that it's really important to make clear that there are ways in which ideas about abolishing slavery or giving Black men the right to vote have very little to do with equality between the races. And it doesn't really, that's not really what one thinks of, because, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. That certainly benefited African Americans. But what I'm saying is, yes, it benefited, but it didn't necessarily mean that those who were advocating for the abolition of slavery wanted all of those free people to be equal with white people in the United States. And that's why I'm making that distinction. So so one of my colleagues, Jonathan Earl, who used to be at the University of Kansas, wrote a book about free soilers, and they were all about abolishing slavery, but not because they were embracing the rights of African Americans, but because they wanted to have a chance to compete by owning land, and if they had to hire laborers, they wanted Southerners to have to hire laborers as well. So I think it's just really important for us to not assume the generosity of spirit when people are advocating for rights for minority groups. I don't want to appear to be cynical. I'm just trying to help people draw this distinction. These amendments were written, and the Southern states who had seceded were pretty much forced to ratify them as not just a symbolic gesture, but as a political gesture that said that they would reunite with the Northern states and that they would comply with what reunification meant.
And to receive representation again, correct?
Right, that's true. So that's what they got, for agreeing to these amendments, for ratifying these amendments. Then they were brought back into the Union as citizens, as states that would have representation in Congress.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's also so many parallels to today, and just precedents for today. Like when I think of all the partisanship, and then I can look back at the Civil War and say, oh yeah, it did happen before.
Yeah, I think if I could leave with kind of a parting thought, I think that the United States truly has this great potential for broad enfranchisement, for an actual democracy, for citizenship participation. I think we have outstanding potential for that. We also know, if we look at our history, that there have been a number of times in the past and even today when there are proponents who are trying to block certain groups from access. And I think that's what we need to understand as individual citizens ourselves, that there aren't these universal truths and there aren't these universal ways in which people access their rights. And so if we are benefiting from rights and actually able to use our rights as citizens, perhaps it's also our obligation to try to extend and ensure that others are able to exercise their rights as well.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed speaking with you.
I've enjoyed it too. It's nice to see you again, Valerie.
Me too.
Well, thanks so much to Kim and Valerie for this really interesting conversation about the 15th Amendment, but it went so much broader and deeper than I think we had even imagined or hoped. So thank you so much for that area of expertise. And I want to thank all of you for joining in on this month's Big Idea. And I want to remind you that we have another one scheduled for March 18th with Cheryl Wilson, who is the Executive Director of KIPCOR, which is the Kansas Institute Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and she does a lot of really interesting work. Her area of expertise is restorative justice. And I think you'll want to join in and find out more about what the 21st century peacekeeping through social justice and restorative justice really looks like for Kansas. And so we want to invite you to that as well. So thanks so much to Drs. Warren and Mendoza, and thank you everyone else, and enjoy the rest of your day and stay warm if you are anywhere in this country, I guess I would say. So thanks so much. Goodbye.